Hello everybody, this is Sap Anderson from Autodesk, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about rendering PBR in Max and making it show up nicely in the viewport. So what is PBR? Well, it stands for physically based rendering. It's a kind of material setup that was originally inspired by something called the Disney Principle BRDF from a SIGGRAPH paper a few years ago. It's been very much popularized by tools like Substance Painter and Substance Designer, and it's heavily used in game engines. And of course in Max we fully support it by the physical material. In a nutshell, you can explain it as materials completely driven by textures. You have a set of kind of standardized textures like the base color, also known as the albedo, which defines the color of things, the roughness, basically how shiny something is at certain points, metalness, which is a black and white kind of mask, which is white in areas where the object is made out of metal and black in areas where it's made out of non-metallic parts. You have the normal to make bump maps, which is of course more important in game engines where you generally have a very low poly model that you want it to look like a high poly one. You can optionally have emission if something is glowing, and sometimes it comes with an AO or ambient occlusion maps, which for rendering we don't tend to use that as much because the renderer kind of does it for you. I will show you all this in a minute here. So to render these kind of materials, we simply use a physical material and we connect the right maps to the right slots with some special settings. Explain these in a minute, and then we're done. That's as simple as it can get. However, to make them show up really nicely in the viewport, we might need to push a few buttons, and that's what I'm going to show you now. So we're going to be working with this model provided by my good friend Sergio Santos, which is kind of a sci-fi weapon kind of thing in this kind of color scheme, not the yellow one. Now this was, as far as I understand, created in Max, is a high poly model, then baked down to this pretty low poly model with all the materials generated in Substance, basically painted in Substance, and this is the kind of result we're going for. And as in the cooking shows, I prepared one earlier, which we have right here, and this is not a rendering, this is actually the Max real-time viewport showing this PBR material the way it looks. Of course it is not just for the viewport, it's rendering as well, since the physical material that we're using is intended to be render independent. PBR shading is of course all based on a single physical material fed with the correct maps in the right slots, all coming from Substance. So the trick is really base color to base color, roughness, metalness, and all these things. One important thing, if we wanted the really short version, maps that are color, which is base color and emission color, you connect them normally. Any other map, it's really important to do this. Turn off gamma correction, because these are not colors, these are data and should not have the gamma curve applied. And finally, in the short version, normal maps, same thing, absolutely imperative to have the gamma override of 1, and normal maps go through the normal bump shader and connect to the bump slot. Doing that shall give you effectively this result in the rendering. To get this result in the viewport requires a few more clicks, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. But one might wonder, why is it like this? Well, it's largely for historical reasons. Like the way the scanline renderer was made, there was need for something called a skylight to do image-based lighting. But modern renderers don't care. Like Art and Arnold, there's an environment map, it automatically lights the scene. But the viewport tends to follow the traditional way, the way scanline did it. Another problem is defaults. Viewport setting, first of all, tends to be set up for performance, not for beauty. And also, as more cool features was added to the viewport over the years, unfortunately the defaults tend to stick to the old way. Rest assured, we're working on this, and just stay tuned, you might see something cool in the future. So let's try to set this scene up for Sergio's gun over here. I have my viewport here. I'm going to launch an active shade which is currently using Arnold. So right now these two will be following each other. Our goal now is to make the rendering and the viewport look as similar as possible. Getting the PBR materials into the rendering is the easy part. Making them show up correctly in the viewport is actually the thing we need to work on. And the reason we need to work on them is not the material, it's the settings for the viewport. For instance, we notice in this scene we have one piece of photometric lighting. If we move that, we see it moves in the rendering but not in the viewport. Why is that? Well, turns out in the default mode, the viewport is set to illuminate with default lights. We want to illuminate with scene lights. We also see that there's no shadow falling on here, which makes us understand that we need shadows turned on. So now this is in shadow. We can see when we move this that we have shadows casting. That is great. Now, this is under a single light. But if I turn on the environment and I put some kind of background color like this, we will see that the gun is also lit up by the environment automatically. Most modern renderer does this automatically. Arnold does it, Art does it. We don't really need to do anything to make that happen. But it turns out that in Max, the old school Max and scanline render, you actually had to do something to make this happen. So what if we start by saying, let's try to turn on the viewport background in the environment background in the viewport. We see, okay, we have the same background. There's no lighting. Well, it turns out that historically Max has used something called the skylight. You can find these under standard light, skylight here. I put this into my scene and I get basically dome lighting. And now you see I have light, but it's white. Why is it white? Because that defaults to a sky color that is white. We wanted to use the scene environment color. And if we notice this, when we let the viewport refine, we actually get a really nice result with this, with basically an ambient occlusion effect. And if we compare this to the rendering, it's really not a huge difference. Unfortunately, while active shade is running, the refine never kicks in, so it looks a little worse here. Now, if we were to use a more advanced environment light than a flat color, I have some HDR of a veranda here, we will see that this lighting is indeed properly colored from the light in the HDR. So this is how you get the lighting, the HDR lighting to show up in the viewport. You need the skylight and you need the skylight set in environment mode. So now basically the lighting between the rendering and the viewport is matching. Next step is dealing with materials. So we are going to assign a material to all the things in the scene. We're going to use a physical material. Of course, the Max physical material was wholly designed to support these PBR style workflow. I mean, PBR stands for physically based rendering, so unsurprisingly, this is what you're supposed to use. And we have these basic setup, the base color, roughness, metalness, etc. are all here. And if I turn up the roughness here, we will see that the material here in the rendering, of course, gets rougher, and the material in the viewport also gets rougher because we can see the highlights spreading out. Now, this is pretty important because the viewport is working on kind of older style thinking where reflections versus highlights are kind of a different thing, whereas real physically based rendering, one of the whole points is that highlights and reflections are one and the same. And we'll see this in a minute when we start playing with our material, because if I turn on metalness and I turn down my roughness for now, what is supposed to happen is that my material becomes completely reflective. So the first thing we notice is nothing happened in the viewport. Why is that? Well, viewport shading actually exists in two quality levels. And we find these here. We have shaded materials and we have realistic materials. And up until now we've been running with shaded materials. Shaded materials cannot is really like the old school, earlier Max version kind of shading, and they cannot support the things we want to do. We want to switch to realistic materials with maps. And now we see we have reflections showing up also in the viewport. Now, of course, these are not real ray traced reflections. We can see details like this metal part is actually reflected here. This doesn't really happen. But for most of these kind of PBR effects, I mean, this is what you would get in the engine anyway. So, I mean, this is not a big difference really. Now, the one missing thing in Max, I would be upfront and tell you, if I turn up the roughness, we will see the roughness showing up here, and we see the highlight increase as before. But if we turn it around and look at the back side where there's no light source, we see that the reflection is actually still sharp. This is the one drawback in the viewport, something we're working on looking at for the future, but right now reflection won't change. But I'll show you that this might not be such a big deal after all. Let's turn down the metalness, and we see, since we're now not looking at the reflections so much directly, it's really almost an invisible difference between the two. So now time to assign some textures. We have the textures that Sergio has created in Substance Painter for this weapon, and we're going to drag them in. And we start with the base color. And here are the textures he provided, and we say one is called base color. Let's probably pick that, and we say open, and I will connect this to the base color. And unsurprisingly, we now get texturing. So already now, by just doing that, we have something that looks not completely unlike the original gun. Bits are obviously missing, but I mean, we're at the very first step. Now, the next texture we're going to look at is, if we go top to bottom in the material, will be the roughness. That's the next one, which comes from the PBR shading. I can actually do this, drag it there, and we'll find the roughness map. Now, here comes a really important thing. The first texture we picked was a color texture, supposed to be interpreted as colors, which entails there's gamma correction baked into them. This is not a color, it is a value, a computed mathematical value. There should be no gamma correction applied, so we need to check here. If you tried before to get your PBR stuff to work correctly in Max, and you feel like the roughness is kind of off, it's probably because of this. And now we see, now we have roughness variations both in our rendering and here in our viewport. It kind of becomes obvious when I turn the back side that yes, the reflections aren't blurred, but as long as there's this highlight from the light to work with, it's clear that we see something. Although when I'm zooming in, I'm noticing something. These textures are kind of blurry compared to this. Why is that? Well, again, the tyranny of the default. It turns out that by default, viewport textures are set to scale themselves down to 512 pixels. Now, that's not a lot. And actually, the scaling down can be a worse performance penalty these days than simply not doing it. So I tend to do this, say max resolution 9999, and that will cause the scaling not to happen. And now we have full resolution in the viewport for the textures. Next step is to hook up the metalness. Now the metalness is a map which defines which part of a material is made of metal and which is not. Now out of Substance Painter it tends to come out called metallic. So this is the one we pick. We need to treat it as data override 1. Super important to do that if you want it to match. So now we have it with some parts made out of metal, which makes them reflect in the color of the texture and basically look more metallic to the eye. Next one, going top to bottom, is actually emission. So we have an emission map. It's called emissive. This one is a color. It's not a mathematical value. It should be treated as a color and hence gamma corrected, so automatic should be on. And don't do the mistake I just did. Not to emission map because it turns white. We want it to be at emission color map. And then we need to turn the emission on, like so. Now we have the proper colored blue lights here, looking fancy. Now there's only one map missing. It's the normal map. Let's put that in. Normal map. And even more important than ever, this is data, not colors. Even though it might look colorful, these are not colors. This is data. You have to check this. It's vitally important. I will show you what goes wrong if you don't. And then we cannot just do this. Well, if we do it, we get something that might look sort of okay. Actually, it looks surprisingly okay, but it's not the correct thing to do. The only thing that happens when we do the connection directly is that it will be using basically the intensity of the normal map as a bump map, basically as height data, which might get an effect that is similar to what you want, but it's not exactly what you want. To use a normal map in Max, you need to use the normal bump shader, this shader. You connect it here to the bump map, and the normal map goes to the input here. Because the normal map is actual directions of the normal encoded as pixel values. There's no guessing for how that is supposed to happen, whereas height-based bump mapping have a tendency to depend a little on the interpretation of the renderer, how much it tweaks the normal for a certain color bump change, etc. For normal maps, the actual values are encoded, and as we see now, we have the full scratchy, nice looking gun, and as we twist it around, it sees it's looking pretty good. And if we compare to this one, I mean, it's looking pretty much the same. Of course, our lighting, we have a different HDRI than what was used in that image, but it's looking pretty good. Now, let me show you what happens if we don't do this right. First of all, I will show you on the normal map what happens if we do this. You see something weird happened? And here's the tricky. It might look like it kinda worked. I mean, in the viewport it looks sort of okay. The rendering though got really weird. And my rule tip to you is that if you can do this, you connect and you disconnect the bump map, and if that looks like it's changing a lot, something is wrong with your normal map. If I have picked the right color space, so no gamma correction, basically add the bumps or not, is the only thing that should happen when I do this. It shouldn't change overall color or anything like that, then something is broken. So this is basically the kind of result you can get with properly done PBR rendering in Max in a renderer and in the viewport. And since the physical material is effectively renderer independent, if I switch over to Art Renderer, you see we get the same result here. I could basically hit render in any renderer and I should get more or less an identical result. Now a careful observer might have noticed I didn't use all the maps, specifically two, provided was a height map and an ambient occlusion map. Now height is just a different way to do bumps. The normal map is kind of the encoded version of the normal, so we don't really need that. So what about ambient occlusion? Well, ambient occlusion is really a trick to make a weak renderer appear more powerful. So in principle, if the goal is rendering, I wouldn't actually use ambient occlusion maps, because those kind of effects that those maps are trying to do is something that the renderer will do for you. If the goal though is to show it in the viewport and do some kind of real-time preview with it, we might want to use the occlusion map in certain ways. We might, for instance, use it to modulate the reflection intensity, so we can use it as the reflectivity map. This makes self-reflection become faked kind of by the occlusion. We could also, either both or independently, also use it as the base weight map, which uses the occlusion also for the base color. And we see now for the viewport appearance, it looks kind of more defined and clearer, more like, even more maybe like the game engine will, although you will see these kind of fake occlusionist effect, like this kind of black rim around here, which is not really well explained by physics. I'm not a huge fan of that appearance personally. So this is kind of a toss-up if you do this. I would say this might actually make the rendering a little worse, because you get these effects kind of doubled up, like the real effect that the renderer would actually produce for you for these kind of things, and then you get the additional, like the additional darkening around here. So if the goal is rendering, I would actually stay completely away from the occlusion map, because that's the job of the renderer to do that properly. If you want to play with this yourself, there's actually a fun site called freepbr.com, which can download these kind of materials of various kinds. Like, for instance, here are some metals available. When you download these, they tend to be set up for game engines, and the naming convention tend to shift a little between game engines. So for instance, I've set up a scene here where I used some of these materials that we were just watching on the other page. It's kind of a scratchy painted metal kind of thing, and this is now currently rendering in Arnold here, and here is our viewport. All the setup is exactly as I was showing before. You have bitmaps going to base, color, roughness, metalness, and your normal map goes through the normal bump to bump map. It's all the same. Always remember these ones need to have the gamma off. The naming convention might be different. Here the metalness is called metal, and the roughness is called roughness, and the normal map is called normal. For another one, this one, yeah, it was called roughness as well. So it can sometimes change. You kind of have to look at the material you download and kind of figure out by the naming what which one goes where, basically. But with the gamma 1 trick and everything, it should be fine. Now we do see here that, for instance, in the viewport, this looks a little too wet because it's a very rough material, and since this particular scene I'm showing it in now is very much based on reflections, and we don't have the true glossy reflections in the viewport, yes, this becomes suboptimal. If we move in this light source here, the difference is less apparent. And for extremely bumpy things like this one, you can barely tell the difference between the viewport, because the bumpiness gets perceived as basically glossy reflections anyway. So while the viewport is not matching exactly for these kind of things, the rendering will match pretty much exactly the appearance that the PBR materials should have. So here is a different example of a whole scene which had PBR materials on it with the matching models. So you have this fire hydrant with all the rust and part put in, etc. Very nice. And here we can see the result both in the viewport and the rendering is pretty cool. One of the really interesting with this one though was the way it was set up, because they had encoded multiple things in the same texture. So they had a reflectivity value, a roughness and a metalness was the red, green and blue component of the texture. To decode that, I was using the OSL bitmap shader, and again, important, turn off any gamma stuff because these are values. And I just hooked up because the OSL one has independent RGB, I just hooked them up independently, and boom, we got the right result. I thought that was actually kind of clever to encode everything in a single texture. So, to recap. We use the physical material, we connect all the maps to the right slots, those that are data with gamma 1, and the normal map through the normal bump map. To make it show up the viewport, make sure the environment is visible in the viewport. You need a skylight set in environment mode. You need to make sure your viewport texture resolution is high enough. You want all the shadows and stuff and scene lines turned on. The easiest way is just to pick the high quality preset. But also the materials need to be set in the right display mode. The easiest way to do that is to pick the menu and say realistic materials with maps. Then, if you want to make it extra beautiful, you can add camera effects like depth of field, tweak the exposure and things like that, and you will get a really nice looking result. There, that's it for today. And do remember, we are completely aware this workflow is suboptimal. Let's just say we're working on it. Have a nice day. Zap out. Bye bye.